Hello. In the last session, we were discussing about SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunity and threat analysis, based on which we discussed that how one can develop this TOWS matrix, TOWS, where you can actually therefore look at different kinds of threats, different kinds of opportunities and see which are the corresponding matching with respect to weaknesses and strengths. Today, we are going to discuss a few more theoretical framework and practical suggestions about developing the strategy alternatives for a services business. To start with, we will look at this famous 5 forces model originally proposed by Michael Porter. So, as you see here, there are 5 interactive forces which are named here, which determine the strategic alternatives facing an organization. So, the first one is rivalry among players within an industry. Now, this, as you know, in the services industry is always very intense, because in services, as we know, entry barrier is relatively much lower, except in certain services where there may be a lot of initial investment needed in infrastructure. In such cases, there can be some kind of financial barrier, but otherwise, as we see in product businesses, there are very seldom very strong technology barriers in services businesses. There are nowadays some information and communication technology intensive services which have some kind of barrier. We have certain knowledge intensive or credence rich services where we have certain other types of barriers, which we have already discussed in some cases, and we will discuss more and more. But today we will look at the general, with the general assumption, we will start that in service businesses rivalry among sellers is very intense. Suppliers in many cases have power, but since many service businesses as inputs take almost commodity items, like if you are in food and beverage, then it will be the food and beverage commodity items which will be inputs to your operations. Or if you are actually a movie distributor and in a movie distribution service, then there will be a number of service suppliers, and many of them will be in alliance with your organization, because that is the nature of that industry. And therefore, suppliers normally are almost part of your network that we have. This network issue we had already discussed earlier in some of the earlier sessions, where we create the value together. So, there is a set of what we call a value constellation based on a certain network. The really very intense threats emanate from this potential entrance, because as we discussed, the entry barrier is low, and buyers can easily switch. The inconvenience of switching is rather low in many service businesses. So, if you do not like one hotel, it will not be very difficult for you to find an alternative hotel. If you do not like the service at one restaurant, it will not be very difficult to move to another restaurant. If you do not like the ambience of one particular club, in most cases you can find another club where you would like to spend your time. So, the buyers are very strong in service businesses. That is why we continuously focus on customer delight, and customer is the key determinant of your business success. So, this is the most important rivalry among sellers and potential entrants. This is a key force combination in service business. And in many cases, service businesses are also prone to competition from substitutes. So, if one is going out for snacks and if there is a rush at the burger restaurant, one may not be, one will be quite amenable as a customer to move to a pizza restaurant and not actually wait. So, there are some very famous or fine dining restaurants where people may be prepared to wait, but there are many categories of services as we discussed, like this fast food service, where people will not wait. So, substitution is also a threat. So, I would say this is a very primary threat. This is an opportunity as well as a threat, and this is another kind of threat in many service businesses. Now, as a result, because the competitive activity and rivalry is a major issue in service business, so constantly tracking your competitors, their offerings, their service innovations become very important in services businesses. In fact, there is many businesses nowadays have organized business intelligence services incorporated within the structure, or they outsource business intelligence services. And in either case, within the business intelligence, in a semiconductor industry, in business intelligence, one would be very conscious, constantly tracking the various kinds of technology developments and new adoptions by competitors. Whereas, in case of many services businesses, the competition analysis is mainly focused on what are the current strategies of the competitors, the new actions that competitors are likely to take, and always looking at what are the service innovations, and even incremental innovations from competitors are very crucial, and therefore, you need to constantly track them. So, successful strategies in the service businesses therefore will constantly track and try to understand the competitor strategies. These strategies can be understood quite easily in terms of those 6 P's of service business that we have discussed before. And so, it is not only the price, but one has to look at what are the innovations in the offering, what kind of new promotion strategies are being adopted, what are the different kinds of distribution innovations that the competition might be introducing. So, all the different aspects, the mix, the strategy mix, will have to also therefore look at all these different aspects. And after this is done, one will have to choose. So, competitive analysis is an input, not necessarily only depending on that input. As we discussed, that in service businesses or in strategy, we need to constantly go inside out and outside in. So, outside means what the competitors are doing, but at the same time you have to constantly look at what are the internal developments, internal problems and opportunities that are evolving, and based on that you have to determine that what will be your competitive advantage, what competitive advantage you will target. So, normally we prefer that a competitive advantage strategy should have about 3 points. So, it should be very crisp. It is not one page statement about competitive advantage. Competitive advantage should normally be maximum 3 to 5 points, and this diagram is often preferred as the 3 vectors that you will focus on for developing your competitive strategy. So, it could be based on different types of features, it could be based on different types of cost initiatives, it could be based on different types of combinations of these two. Let us look at how these are done. So, this is a statement that the objectives of a competitive strategy in services business is to generate a competitive advantage to enhance customers' delight and create customer advocacy. So, this we have already discussed that in services businesses we constantly try to go up this pyramid, that from transactional instances of service procurement we want to go to relational paradigm, and ultimately we want our customer to become our marketer. So, customer advocacy. This diagram I have drawn before, and it is important that we highlight it again, that in service businesses any kind of competitive advantage needs to stay focused on customer delight. So, which means that if it is not going to enhance customer delight, then possibly investment in that aspect of the competitive strength may not be very relevant. So, this is a point that in a business strategy there may be different aspects with respect to operations. In a business strategy there could be financing issues, different types of financing, leveraging, etc. may be involved. But in competitive strategy we are mainly looking at the organization and its interfaces with the marketplace and the forces imposed by substitutes and by competitors and by new entrants, and based on that you are developing what to do at this interface between the organization and the market. So, competitive strategy therefore is a bit narrower in scope compared to the overall business strategy. According to Porter, there are these interesting combinations or 5 competitive strategies. These are called the generic competitive strategies because they are applicable in most businesses and in most situations one or the other will be relevant. So, let us look at first the overall low cost leadership strategy. In service businesses, in most service businesses, this is a primary strategy, because as the entry barrier is low and customers are often quite price sensitive, therefore, you need to stay focused. There is hardly any service today where low cost is not an important competitive strategy. So, here obviously you have to scrutinize each cost activity, manage each cost lower year after year. That means it is not, you can't take a position today then say this is LC, but a low cost position. You have to understand that others are constantly trying to lower their cost. So, you have to have a plan which is year upon year how your costs are going to slide down. That could be coming from scale, that could be coming from different kinds of sourcing strategies. So, one will have to look at each individual situation, and but overall you must continuously lower your cost. So, re-engineering of your business processes is very important, and that is why if you remember in our earlier sessions we laid so much emphasis on mapping the business process, creating the service blueprint and finding the bottlenecks. Every time we had two major objectives: to lower the transaction cost, lower the transaction time, and increase customers' convenience, increase customers' convenience in terms of decreasing the hassle, extra movements. So, time saving, cost saving at every stage found through the service blueprint, finding the failure points at the touch points or failure possibilities. We discussed about that FMEA, failure mode effect analysis, etc. earlier. So, all those need to be deployed, so that we are constantly doing this BPR or business process re-engineering, so that we are constantly able to reduce our cost. Now, competitive strengths that come up from the lower cost is that you have a much better handle on pricing. So, you can push out new entrants by taking some aggressive pricing stance. Now, you cannot take an aggressive pricing stance unless you have a very good handle on your cost, otherwise you will land up into a lot of loss which you may not be able to recover later. And so, low cost is really a very significant barrier to entry in many price sensitive service businesses. So, if you do not have minute attention to cost, then for example, if you are in the supermarket, hypermarket business, where people are very conscious about, because you are dealing in commodities, and if people will shift if you are not able to offer attractive pricing. So, that is why you will see the most of the bazaars, most of the supermarkets, they continuously harp on the attractive pricing package offers which they are able to extend. So, also you are, if you have a better cost control, then you have a stronger position, and therefore, you are able to negotiate longer supply contracts. So, these are good competitive advantage that come out of the low cost position. So, for example, this is a example taken from airline carriers. So, there can be X, Y, Z, M, N, O, P, number of, these are actual data, only the names we have camouflaged for legal reasons. But which it means is that, suppose you are tracking a key cost element, which is operational cost per air mile, seat air mile per day. Now, there so this cost per seat air mile, if this is the lowest cost, then you have to be very clear that if you are not able to go beyond this point, say, and if this is your position, then you should be clear that this is a major competitive challenge for you, and then you have to have alternatives where you will able to attract customers in spite of this difference. In most cases, it is very difficult to manage a very large gap here. If your lowest price, lowest cost competitor is 9.66, then maybe you can be here, but if you are here, then you are out, and that is a very important point in many service businesses, like for example, this low cost, no frills airlines business. If you are in that business and you see that you are unable to reduce your costs below this point, then it is better for you to see that maybe then you are no longer a player in the low cost airlines industry. You then may need to become a full service airlines, where your competition will be a different set of people, and maybe then you will be playing in this club, and there actually therefore you will become the lowest cost competitor, and that will be an advantage. So, which field you are competing in is very important. That will be often determined by what kind of cost structure you are able to achieve. Now, when is overall low cost strategy best? For example, in every city, like in Kanpur we have Naveen market, like in every city there will be a marketplace where most of the retailers of regular merchandise products, so whether it are grocery products or various kinds of fashion products, apparels, shoes, all these will be available in a central marketplace. So, it may be New Market in Calcutta or Baliganj market in Calcutta, it can be Lajpat Nagar market or different other local markets like Bhogal in Delhi or Sarojini market. It will be the Crawford Palace or something in Mumbai, or it could be the Bandra Hill Road in Mumbai. So, everywhere there will be a marketplace where people will go for general merchandise, apparels, shoes, daily wear stuff, and often also for groceries. In such markets, there is a very little distinction, almost everybody uses the same source, the suppliers are the same. So, price becomes very important because one is dealing in commodity, and in such a case low cost strategy is absolutely imperative, because you can't very much differentiate. And low cost strategy is not a very good strategy if there are technological breakthroughs that create a completely different cost structure. So, then just by doing the same thing that you have been doing earlier and reducing cost may not be the right strategy, because the competition has actually changed the total cost structure. So, it happens very often in, say, technology intensive services where a new technology obsoletes the old cost structure, and mobile telephony, etc. We have often seen this is happening. So, if competitors find it relatively easy and inexpensive to imitate the leader's low cost method, then also this is not very not a very good strategy. Now, the other side of this strategy is this broad differentiation strategy, where you want to develop the customer loyalty based on some key features in your service. So, this is how actually we try to develop certain features that attract a certain type of customers. Here segmentation becomes very important, because you can't be everything to everybody with this differentiation strategy. So, you have to create a certain set of differentiators and match a particular segment of customers, and that is how you can build long term relationships. So, differentiation opportunities can be derived out of supply chain, out of certain kinds of service innovation, your operational excellence, and marketing sales types of activities. So, if you analyze the way for example, the multiplexes, that entertainment multiplexes are today competing, you will see they are most often trying to create differentials. So, whether it is an amusement park, whether it is a large complex having movie halls and theatres, etc., they all try to create certain kinds of features which create a long term relationship. So, there are certain sets of services where cost, and this is true for most services, but there are certain other technology intensive services where differentiation can play an important part. So, cost is the primary driver for competitive advantage in services. Differentiations can also be done, And as a result, there are of course certain types of services where we can combine the two and create combinations which are often called best cost, which means a person is giving high quality as well as low cost, because the Japanese or the Koreans, they found long time back that investing in high quality improves your yield, ultimately brings down your cost. So it is possible to offer that unassailable combination of low cost, high quality, and this is now coming into services field. And if you observe the competitive steps taken by the intensely competitive in the intensive competitive field of say mobile phone services or mobile data services, you will see whether it is the Reliance Jio, whether it is Airtel, whether it is Vodafone, they are all trying to come up with this best cost provider strategy, where you can combine low cost and differentiation. This is a key requirement today in many service areas. So you need to be adept at continuously lowering your costs and continuously offering. So cost must be continuously lowered and you must continuously innovate, sometimes most of the time incremental, but sometimes you may have to radically change, and this is the trajectory that we see now in service businesses more and more. So this combination of low cost and differentiation is almost becoming the norm in service businesses. So this low cost provider strategy is very important, and as I was mentioning, this coming battle for 4G mobile voice and data in India will show you as it is evolving right now, and different service providers like Reliance and Airtel and Vodafone are coming. You will see that almost every strategy of all these major players will be derived out of this best cost, that is low cost, high quality approach. Now, there is another generic strategy which we call the focus strategy. The focus can be of two types. One can be that focus strategy based on low cost, where you actually look at a narrow customer segment, and in that segment you beat the competition with the lower cost, because you are actually matching the exact requirement of the customer segment, and therefore you know what frills can be deleted, and you come up with a product which is optimally suitable for that customer segment. So as you see, therefore segmentation is very closely linked with focus. The focus strategy can also be based on differentiation. You can find a segment of customer who like a certain types of features or certain level of, so therefore you will find a focus strategy often being deployed by airlines for their business class passengers. And so you have to choose a niche where customers have a distinctive preference, unique needs or special requirements, and based on that you will be able to develop services. An interesting exploration that you can do is this young urban professionals. They are actually an emerging big group of consumers, and for them different types of very high quality crash or staycation. That means these young professionals, they do not have much of time, they can't take a long vacation because they are building their career, they are working 14 hours a day, and they are not prepared to take leave, or their organization is reluctant to give them long leave. So they may take a weekend off and stay in a hotel in the city, and hotels love them because normally hotels run lean during the weekends, and they create a particular service package which is often called staycation, that as opposed to vacation. That means you stay at your own place and you have a vacation like relaxing environment in a 5-star hotel, enjoying a special package. Also in fashion, whether in retailing or e-tailing, we are seeing this focus strategy coming up. So, based on this, we can talk about this famous the Ansoff matrix, which I have already introduced to you earlier, that if we take current market, present market, new market, and present services being offered and new services that are possible for offering, you can develop these 4 alternative strategy combinations: market penetration, new service penetration, new service development rather, I think we should write here new service development, and diversification and market development. So, I would request you to, as an assignment, to populate this matrix and give me examples that how different types of services that you are competitive services you see emerging in this segment, in this quadrant, in this quadrant, and in this quadrant. You look around, look at the various TV promotions, print promotions, look at the hoardings around you in your city, and most interestingly, you should look at the business papers, the business dailies, and or listen to the business channels on TV, and you will find a number of examples, and you can then present this 2 by 2 matrix populated with examples, service businesses who are using this as their strategy canvas. So, with this background, now we will get into some of the other more the remaining discussions on pricing, very important point that we still have not discussed, as well as some other more advanced processes for creating the competitive value proposition. So, next 2 sessions will be on pricing. Thank you.